Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Let the filibustering begin.
Welcome to Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Filibuster here on the Nerd Party, the only podcast on the network that is not currently watching The Mandalorian because we're in the UK. Boo-hoo. I sense a great tremor in the force, like a million voices suddenly cried out in terror and was suddenly silenced. That was all of us Star Wars fans in the UK unable to access this show in fear of going on Twitter for spoilers. I'm your co-host Alice King, and with me as always is the Winter Soldier to my Falcon, the Arthur Fleck to my Murray Franklin. It's Lee Hutchison. How are you this week?
Yeah, good. Soldiering on with Apple TV, so that's what we really want. You know, just a couple of TV shows to pick from, not a brand new Star Wars show and all their back catalogue. You know, I'm happy enough with that.
How many streaming services do you currently have?
I have Netflix, Amazon Prime, Mubi, Apple TV, Now TV, but I have that for free. And yeah, and I have Stargate Command, which is ceasing on December 31st. So yeah, I've got a few.
Yeah, no, it's there's too much choice for us, isn't it? Really, at the moment, it's like everyone was like, oh, you know, Netflix is like, you know, I remember the days when we only had like 3 to 4 channels on the telly, and now there's about a dozen different streaming services, all with exclusive content, and it's getting to the point now where we have to pick and choose our battles as to who we're actually going to subscribe for. But you know, I guess we'll see what happens with Disney Plus when it eventually gets all the way over to the UK at the end of March, and everything that you did want to see has already been spoiled for you. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'm sure we can trust the Americans not to spoil anything.
Oh, of course, they're very, very tight-lipped. I've certainly found that with Game of Thrones and stuff like that as well. They make sure not to ruin anything for us. So, but on today's episode, we've got another thing that I want to talk about, and we're forgoing the news and reviews because there's an issue that anyone who's been following film Twitter will have been unable to escape, and that is the Martin Scorsese versus the MCU. The debate that the Marvel movies are not cinema has been all over the news, and I just want to sit down with you and sort of get your take on it. Now, this all sort of kicked off from all stemmed really from an interview in Empire magazine last month that was conducted by Nick DeSemlin, who's interviewing Martin Scorsese about The Irishman. And in relation to the Marvel movies and the use of de-aging techniques, Scorsese said, "I don't see them. I tried, but that's not cinema. Honestly, the closest I can think of them, as well made as they are, with the actors doing the best job that they can under the circumstances, is that they are theme parks. It's not the cinema of human beings trying to convey emotional, psychological experiences to another human being." Cue lots of clickbait articles accusing Martin Scorsese of belittling and hating on the MCU, not respecting the franchise, and of course thousands of think pieces as to what is and isn't cinema. This has led to every white-haired older filmmaker from Almodovar to Ken Loach being asked about their thoughts on Marvel. So Lee, I come to you. What are your initial thoughts on this? Is it valid criticism or a case of old man yells at cloud?
For me, I'm kind of just like, how long has this been going on for? Just shy of a month now? For me, yeah, I don't understand how it's continued to go on. I think it's the fact that it's kind of spilled into everything. It seems like anyone that's got an interview with any sort of person of talent, whether involved in the MCU or not, has been asked, so what do you make of this grudge match? Are you Team Scorsese or Team Marvel? And you get comments like, well, people can enjoy what they want, or I have nothing but respect for Martin Scorsese, or you get Ken Loach going, don't care for it. Like, this is just normal kind of conversations that people have that I've had it with people as well. There's things I certainly don't care for, but it's just the fact that this has become the dominant conversation. And how my friend Stevie always makes a joke that there's too much news. Any scandal is immediately blown over within like a day because there's too much news, it drowns it out. But how has this kind of continued on so long? Even like yesterday I saw now Chris Evans has been, here's his opinion on it. It's the absolute kind of worst conversation. Like, both are valid. If you enjoy Marvel, that's great. If you don't enjoy it and think it's the absolute worst, that's also fine. It's just, why do all these people continue to get asked what their opinion is on this one and only subject. You think we have enough problems in the world as it is at the moment?
Yeah, I know. I think would this have blown over perhaps if the quote hadn't been "it isn't cinema"? If Scorsese had just said, "Marvel movies, I don't particularly care for them. They're well made, but they're not my cup of tea." End of. People would have gone, "Okay, that's fair enough." But I think people seem to latch onto this idea of that's not cinema, and you know one could easily have just shut down the debate by going, well, of course it's cinema. They are screened in a cinema. Avengers Endgame is the highest grossing film of all time. Surely it's a good thing that a movie like that is inspiring people to get off their butts, away from the TV screens, away from their streaming services, heading into a multiplex, paying 15 odd bucks or 10 quid or even 15 quid, 20 quid if you're using it on the 4DX or IMAX or whatever, to go and see it on the big screen, to get that big screen experience. The fact that the Marvel universe has managed to basically build a franchise of this interconnecting story of 22 films should probably be applauded. A lot of other franchises have tried and failed quite quickly to sort of build on this sort of world building sort of thing, but it hasn't worked. But I mean, Scorsese himself is always, and now whenever he's being interviewed, he's always got something else to say, and he followed it up with a letter in the New York Times in which he sort of referred to the whole thing, and he actually sort of brought points like he would refer to Alfred Hitchcock as a franchise in himself. At one point, he was the franchise of the sort of 60s and 70s, a recognizable brand whose films were designed to deliver a thrill or other sort of response from the audience, but he claimed that there was actually more to them behind the filmmaking, behind the responses. He would argue that it's the homogenization more of these movies, that there's not enough points of differentiation within each film. He sort of called them, I think he had an interview recently with Ali Plum on the BBC where he sort of said there wasn't enough points. It's basically the more sort of sequels or almost remakes of each other. It's like the same sort of film. There wasn't enough risk in them. And then sort of Kevin Feige sort of put his 2 cents worth in this week, where it's saying, well, how can you say there's no risk? We killed off half our characters in Infinity War. But then I would potentially argue that because it's a comic book movie, anything in science fiction, they're not really dead. A lot of them are going to come back. So maybe that's where he was coming from that point. So, I mean, do you think, we could sort of go into the first point, which is, he specifically called them theme park rides. How many people who are complaining about this comparison probably went to see Endgame in 4DX with the moving chairs? Do you think it's a valid sort of criticism to compare them to theme park rides?
I've called them theme park rides, and I don't necessarily mean it in sort of the most negative way. That when I kind of think of these sorts of films, as part of it is the shared experience. When I've gone to see something like Eighth Grade came out the same day as Avengers Endgame, like. That is a film that I watched in sort of a half-empty cinema. I really connected with it, really enjoyed it. But the experience I get when I go see Avengers Endgame, which I enjoyed somewhat less than Eighth Grade, is that, this is like sort of a theme park. It's like, very, it's an experience. It's very base level. I know what I'm getting. I know it's going to be a ride. I know when there's going to be the highs and lows within this sort of film. And, when, the creatures are all whacking each other and all that sort of stuff, it's fun and enjoyable. And it's sometimes the fun is also in the queue to these rides, when you get the sort of layer to detail and attention that you think, this is an experience. And that's kind of what I always feel like it is. It is sort of a theme park, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. Not necessarily a negative thing in my opinion.
No, I think there is always a time and a place. People want that sort of, they're in the mood for a big sort of blockbuster, something that takes them away from the everyday world, the stresses of life. They want to be taken to another world where they don't have to worry about anything. And that is something that these movies certainly, deliver on. There's something like, when going to see one of these films on opening night, the midnight screening, where that everyone is there for the same thing. It's almost with the Marvel movies now that the franchise is about 10 years old, they've almost grown up with these characters, and it's delivering that payoff. I don't think there's anyone in that screen who watched it who didn't have some sort of emotional reaction to, from the whole sort of portal sequence with the Avengers assemble Captain America picking up the hammer and stuff like that. They got massive cheers. People were screaming their heads off. They love that kind of thing. So it creates a reaction. Similar to watching, say, a horror movie or a comedy movie with an audience. There is that sort of thing, that people jumping at the same time, and it's nice to see that sort of response to a movie on the big screen. Whereas sometimes if you watch something like that at home just on your own, maybe you're missing out in that thing. But I think Scorsese's sort of description is valid, certainly with certain blockbusters, because an actual theme park ride, such as a roller coaster, that'll be researched, workshop, designed to within an inch of its life to provide the most thrilling experience for an audience. And one could argue that franchise films are done the same way. These companies such as Disney, Universal, whatever, invest such a huge amount of money in them that they want to see a return. So they're going to want to make sure that it hits certain marks. That's why you've got all these sort of test screenings and whatever, seeing what works for the audience, what doesn't, sort of go back, do reshoots, to try and basically make sure that it ticks all the boxes. But then I guess there is a danger at some point that it becomes overworked and then can potentially miss the mark. Such as, certainly DC have had issues where they're trying to replicate that Marvel formula, but it's not really clicking. They've now had success with Joker sort of going in a completely different direction. One would argue that perhaps this debate is still going on with the fact that Joker is still the number one movie in the world at this moment in time, and the fact that Scorsese himself was an executive producer and apparently at one point was even lined up to maybe direct the movie. So the fact that he is linked to a comic book movie, people were maybe sort of looking at the fact that he was sort of dissing these comic book movies as well, and potentially this whole Marvel DC debate getting up again as well. So, I mean, do you think there's maybe sort of too much time sort of spent in sort of overanalyzing and overworking these blockbusters in order to sort of hit every sort of possible demographic? And
More so than ever, and I think you kind of have to look at, what was it, Kevin Feige or whoever came out this week and said, well, you have to get the Disney Plus now because the TV shows are going to cross over with these films, in particular sort of Doctor Strange and whatever the sequel's called. You really need to watch this TV show to get in with this film. And I get that they've kind of continued to sort of do that, where I've never really watched any of these Marvel TV shows, so I don't necessarily know how much crossover there has been into films. But this idea that and I've seen it with other things. It's not necessarily just all Marvel, where it's like you need to read the comic book before you go see the film. And then I watched this sort of TV series to get kind of what was going on in the background, and it becomes too much. And you think, like, the film ultimately has to stand on its 2 feet. And I think with the Marvel films, when I've gone to see them, I'm like, yeah, I got away without reading the comics or this sequel TV show or kind of whatever to enjoy it and to think it was a good time. But it's just becoming an increasingly tedious affair where it's like you feel like you've got to go into this film, but you have to do an incredible amount of research. It can't just be something that's just necessarily enjoyed in isolation. It's got to be cross-marketing with something else.
yeah, no, I think Infinity War and Endgame were essentially they had reached a point where they could not make them for an audience that did not have at least some prior knowledge of the films that had come before. They'd reached that point where there was just too many characters and stuff like that. Whereas all the other ones, they do try and make them slightly standalone, but for the fans, there is sort of branching off points where you can go, oh no, I get that reference, or oh yeah, no, I enjoyed that bit that links into that. I mean, I'm thinking of, for an example of a sort of TV show, sort of film that worked as being separate enough that you could enjoy it without having seen anything. But if you'd have seen the TV show, obviously you would have got a lot more. Was Serenity in Firefly. I saw Serenity without having ever seen Firefly and thought, this is a sort of fantastic story. It sets up the world and the sort of the dynamic of the group in like that opening shot where it goes around the ship. But then it's like when he starts killing off all these characters at the end, I'm like, wow, absolutely anyone could die. This is really cool. But I didn't have that emotional connection with the characters as people had who'd seen the TV show. So I then went back and then I got more of a connection at the end of it after seeing all that. But it still worked as a complete film for me without any prior knowledge of what had come before. So I guess it's always finding that sort of balance about trying to do that. And I think, there is the Marvel shows that came before. the Netflix ones, Daredevil and all that, had no real connection to the movies, what was going on there. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was meant to kind of tie along, but I think they kind of got blindsided by the sort of Winter Soldier reveal that, hey, S.H.I.E.L.D. was actually Hydra all along. And it's like, oh, right, okay. And from that point on, it kind of sort of became a bit separate. But yeah, this whole sort of, it's going to be interesting to see how it works. I mean, clearly it's done with an idea of let's drive people towards Disney Plus if we can, get them to sign up and get that way. But I'm going to be interested to see how many people maybe stick with Marvel going forward, knowing that they've got to, like you say, put in all this extra effort into sort of keeping up with all the things. Because, occasionally, like you say, with these comics, you'll get like a graphic novel or a comic sort of, prelude or something, the events just running up to the film and stuff like that. But you don't need, they're not essential, whereas it sounds like Marvel are almost sort of doubling down on it. It's going to be interesting to see how that works, especially when certain countries and regions are on a delay as well for getting the series as well. Now, some people, this is just a side point, but some people are complaining about Scorsese that, he's slagging off all these superhero movies, of which are all the same, and that he only makes gangster movies. I will just point out New York, musical, The Last Waltz, music documentary, Last Temptation of Christ, Story of Jesus, Age of Innocence, period film, Wolf of Wall Street, comedy looking at the financial district, and then Silence, a film about, Judeo-Christian monks going to Japan. So I think he's got enough diversity in his back catalogue that, sure, he's known mostly for the gangster ones because that's what everyone sort of grew up watching, but I think it's unfair to just paint him as this one person who does this only one thing.
Yes, I know that's what some of the kind of discourse that's pissed me off. Like, people can have disagreements and kind of breakdowns and opinions, but some of the stuff that's been kind of labelled against kind of Scorsese has been so silly. It seems like some people are just so desperate to tweet something out that they never actually stop and think. Like, I even saw one this week going like, yeah, here we go, another mobster movie with Al Pacino directed by Martin Scorsese. Despite the fact that Martin Scorsese and Al Pacino have never made a film together, it's just absolutely kind of ridiculous. And then, people then will come back going, well, Iron Man's been in blah 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 many films and so on. It's just round and round kind of stupidity, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. It's the discourse is just it's so frustrating to watch at times. It's like, if you're going to argue about it, at least get the facts straight, and then we can have like a proper discussion about it. But when it's people who just like blithely tweet things without even really sort of doing the proper work into it, that's when it does get frustrating. And the fact that, like you say, it's still going on probably 3 to 4 weeks after this debate came about is just crazy. And what I think, this is sort of my next point on it, is the not cinema comment that you made. I think that was meant as more of a plural sort of thing, where what he was really meaning is that they are not cinema as a whole, and that they shouldn't be the only thing that cinema is about these blockbusters. That there needs to be more movies available, and that it's not just these franchise films eating up all available screen space and airtime. And, ironically, this has actually been exemplified by filmmakers such as Scorsese, who is currently promoting The Irishman, and Ken Loach, who's currently promoting his film Sorry I Missed You, and that all their promo time to talk about their new films is being dominated by people asking them about Marvel movies, and it just basically is just a head scratcher on that one. It's like, they're trying to get their movies into cinemas, and all they're being asked about is, well, what do you think about the new Marvel movie? And it's basically just proving their point. He was asking for more support for smaller films, smaller filmmakers, and the studios are now adverse to risk. Would you sort of claim that would you believe that's true, that studios are kind of adverse to risk these days?
I think they're spending so much money on investing in their streaming services that I think they've taken the eye off the ball. Think of Paramount. When was the last time that you saw any sort of really great original property from Paramount? Fox is kind of struggled, really. I'm very much against this sort of Disney Fox buyover, but in terms of Fox kind of releases, obviously Star Wars is now part of the Disney franchise, and it's been for years, but Fox haven't really been putting out great kind of franchise or big tent kind of fare. Really, there's been the odd exception. Warner Brothers incredibly going down, focused on kind of franchise films. It's the same as well. They all seem to be trying to invest in what's safe. 5 franchise Fantastic Beast films. It's too much, and it seems that they're kind of crippled. Like when you get something like Ad Astra, whether you liked it or not, it had to be admired that a studio was investing in something like that. And I think there should be more of that. It's not just kind of the easy demographics to kind of target that will go to the cinema. People like myself and you will go see those films. You've got our money, but we also want to see more different content, something new, brave. Maybe it works, doesn't work, but we'll go along and see it. And I think there's been too little of that from some of the big studio names, the tent poles, as it were.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is, Scorsese, one of his major complaints, people have been going, oh, how are we meant to see his film anyway? He went to Netflix to make it, but he's on record as saying that Netflix was the only studio that was going to give him the money, $200 million, admittedly quite a lot of money, in order to make this film. A lot of that went into the sort of CGI for the de-aging things to allow sort of De Niro, Pacino and Pesci to play their characters over a large period of time. Back in the day, Godfather Part 2, you would just have 2 actors. You'd have De Niro playing a young Brando, and then you'd have Marlon Brando in the older bits. But, when studios are not willing to spend money on original films, they're only really willing to do the franchises because they know they can guarantee a return on that, then, that is indeed part of the problem. People have said over the last few years that the sort of mid-range film of, like $60 to $80 million, it's incredibly difficult to make a film like that these days. Ad Astra is, maybe an exception these days. I really, really liked it. The ending maybe left me slightly emotionally cold, but I think it was maybe the point. I think I really want to rewatch it to see it. But seeing something like that on the big screen was fantastic, and it was great to see, Fox taking a punt on that. And, at that point they had were finishing off the Disney sort of buyout sort of phase, so maybe it was going out before that. But you've got studios. We've talked on previous podcasts about the sort of Annapurna sort of situation where they're currently on a run of losing quite a bit of money on films, so therefore they're gonna have to pick their battles and stuff like that. But we had this whole thing earlier in the year with Booksmart, which had rave reviews across the board, but when it was released fairly wide in America opening weekend, it didn't have the same result as people thought. People thought it was going to do potentially, $100 million like Superbad was going to do, and it didn't. But I think it's done better than it had, but it was a film which had a very small budget. It's probably made a profit by now. So it's all about the rollout and how these films are consumed these days, because you've got these cinemas saying, oh, we need to see more original things, but then you've got chains over here like Cineworld and View who won't screen films that are on Netflix or other streaming services because they don't adhere to the theatrical window. This whole Roma situation last year, and then Irishman this year, so you've got to go to your independent to see it. But who was ever really going to screen Roma for 12 weeks in the cinema in a multiplex before it went out to DVD and stuff like that? No, you would have got maybe 2 weeks before something else came along, and then they dropped the screen space for, the next blockbuster and stuff like that. So I think, the cinema distributors and exhibitors, I think the model, they're trying to hold on to the old way of doing things, and I think that they're basically trying to put up like a sandbank against a huge sort of storm and tidal wave that's coming, and I think things have to change in the future. What do you think?
Yeah, you look at the cinemas at the moment. I don't feel there's been much in the way added kind of relatively new recently, and it's just sort of, it's dominated by kind of these big films. And again, I'm wanting to throw money at these places. There's almost seems to be so much choice sometimes with like when you can see sort of Terminator or some of these kind of bigger movies that you go into some screenings even on a kind of weekend and the screen's half empty, whereas if they sort of go, right, you know what, we'll kind of condense a couple of those screenings into one, and then we'll move in maybe we'll put even just 1 or 2 screenings of an 8th grade or something along those lines, something from one of the kind of smaller houses, and we'll give it a thing, and if people want to come along, they can do it. And I've often found when you give people the opportunity, people will turn up, we'll give them their money. But if you don't, they're just going to go spend it on Netflix instead, or something else, or not bother visiting your cinema. You've got to give people the choice, or else we're just going to go elsewhere.
Exactly, because Netflix, the choice is you've got thousands of films, well, probably thousands of films available on there, and the choice is yours of when and when to watch it. You look at the times and you think, okay, say when you get to last week in December, you're thinking, oh great, what am I going to watch? It's after Christmas, I'd like to see something. And then you look at your local multiplex and it's got 10 screens, and let's say 8 of those 10 screens have got Star Wars in a variety of different formats. You've got Cats, and then maybe one screen's got Little Women, and then you look at the times and you're like, okay, I'd like to see Little Women, but then, all right, the time doesn't really work for me, so I'll just stay home and watch something on Netflix. That's the thing, and even sort of, independents are struggling with this at the moment. Christmas is always a difficult time for them. I've looked at my local independent and I was scratching my head in disbelief that screens 1 and 2, the big screens, after Christmas have still got Star Wars and Cats, and then Little Women opens in the smaller screen the day after Boxing Day, and I'm like, well, I can guarantee you right now that Star Wars is not going to get more than 65 people after Boxing Day, and you're going to have a problem with more people wanting to see Little Women because it's going to get great awards buzz and stuff like that. So it's about giving people the option and the choice of what to see. And they're called multiplex. You're meant to be able to see multiple films at any one time, not the same film in multiple formats, I think. And I think that's where they're going wrong these days. I was down in London recently and they were talking at the O2, and they've got one of these Screen X or something where you artificially get some extra film added onto the sides as the film goes down the walls and stuff like that, and it's like, who wants that? It's not how the filmmaker designed the film, so I don't see why I would want to pay any money to see that. And it's just another
sounds like a roller coaster.
It does sound
experience.
Like a theme park ride, and it's one of those ones where it's like, I didn't want to see it, and it's like I think our friend sort of Ross has sort of said it, with the Cineworld in Edinburgh having sort of IMAX and then 4DX, and then have they added in like VIP screens or whatever? It's just limiting the amount of choice that you've got because there's only certain films will screen in those screens, and it's like, where are you going to go to see something like The Farewell, or especially in Oscar season, there's where you get maybe a dozen new films every week. It's like, that's the point. When how do we cope with how are we going to see all these new releases? And it's a difficult one to argue with, because people want diversity, but then you look at the UK box office and the cinemas will argue that, well, people aren't going to want to see these films because, let me just run through the top 10 at this current point in time. So at number 1, it's Endgame, Disney. The Lion King, Disney. Toy Story 4, Disney. Joker, Warner Brothers. Captain Marvel, Disney. Aladdin, Disney. Spider-Man, Sony/Disney. Downton Abbey, Universal, based on an existing TV series. Dumbo, Disney. And then number 10, Rocketman, which was actually Paramount. So there we go, an original title from Paramount, although based on, a very popular, well-known musical artist. We've got to sort of look at, all those are, apart from Rocketman, are currently basically sequels or remakes or based on existing franchises. I think you can basically say Dumbo and Rocketman will not be in the top 10 by the end of the year because you've still got Star Wars and Frozen 2 to come out. So you're looking at Disney having 8 of the top 10, or 9 of the top 10 almost there. And, you look at number 12 at the list currently is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a great result for that. But, Tarantino is a fairly big name in terms of director, so he's got that draw. And then you have to go down to number 17 for The Favourite, which had all the Oscar buzz at the beginning of the year. So in terms of original, filmmaking, the numbers don't add up, but, it's that sort of chicken and the egg. It's like, if people can't see them at the cinema, they're not going to pay the money they're going to be able to pay the money, and therefore that's why you're driving people to go and see these things. What do you think is the solution here?
It's an incredibly complicated one. I think it ultimately comes down to these cinemas are you see them posting record-breaking profits. You see Disney, etc., getting their record-breaking profits. I know that they're certainly not putting their money into staff costs. Half these people are on kind of low minimum wage. It's not being kind of put onto the price of food. That's not being reduced in any way. You look at the price of if you don't have these cinema passes, you could be looking at £13 a ticket, £40 for a family to go along to see a movie. The money isn't being invested back into necessarily the real audience experience of what we would like. It's not sort of about a Screen X or this. It's about what does the audience want. And I think the audience would respond well to, as I say, it's not asking much to say give up a screen for an afternoon for a couple of hours. A lot of these indie movies aren't sort of pushing more than 2 hours. Most of them seem to be in and around that sweet spot of 90 minutes. Give people the choice, give people the option, and invest some of that money back into, as you say, it's a multiplex. Give people choices. I think that's only one way that we can look to really improve the experience, but ultimately it's going to be a long road to giving any sort of kind of representation on par with any sort of Disney or Marvel or whatever kind of movie. But it helps, it starts.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting point you raised there about sort of investing the money back into the movie going experience, because I think there's a lot of people who want to see these types of films but are maybe put off by the prospect of going to a multiplex or somewhere in order to see this film, where they know that that there's not an usher in the screen the whole time. There's going to be people in there on their phones, and the price of the food and stuff. The price is obviously an issue. Projection wise, you don't have that sort of security of knowing that there's a projectionist in the booth making sure that the film's running correctly and stuff like that. You've got, these days at certain multiplexes, probably 30 minutes of ads and trailers, and it's just maybe that is putting people off. And when they can create almost, and with technology at home, with a surround sound system, sort of full HD TV, you can almost create a decent sort of home cinema setup at home where you can enjoy it without having to leave your home and stuff like that. And the consumption of media is clearly, how people are consuming films is changing. People are watching films on their phones or their tablets and stuff like that. With all the filmmakers who say Netflix is, they were the only ones who made me the offer to make the film as I wanted to. They may get a very small theatrical release, but I don't think any filmmaker, if they put their hand on the heart, would say, I wanted to make my film for people to watch on the phone. They want that big screen. They make it to be seen on a big screen for that theatrical experience. And I think we need to get back to that way. And I guess, is that going to be looking to sort of just exhibitors and sort of production companies Fox Searchlight is a difficult one with the fact that they're now being taken over by Disney. 20th Century Fox is essentially probably is going to be absorbed, and all their films will be released as Disney films these days. But do you think Disney will still continue to release sort of Oscar bait and sort of the smaller sort of films, such as the success they've had with things like Little Miss Sunshine? Do you think they're still going to go for that kind of material and release it under the Fox Searchlight banner, or is it going to be a case that A24, do you think, will step up into that slot and become, I think Fox Searchlight we're celebrating 25 years this year, but do you think A24 is going to become the main player? Obviously this allows us to sort of talk about our other podcast, A24 Project, where obviously we are huge A24 stands, but do you think they have the clout nowadays to become that sort of major independent player?
I think they've got the opportunity to, and I think it also places like Neon, hopefully Annapurna kind of comes back around. I think there's plenty of opportunities. I was reading today sort of how Disney are sort of looking to potentially use kind of Fox Searchlight to make sort of prestige pictures, but the catch is it's going to be for Hulu in America. So I think the Fox Searchlight will live on, but I think it's going to be probably largely on a streaming platform, and then the odd exception where the odd film maybe gets buzz, sort of kind of similar to what Netflix has done in the past few years. They will maybe give it a kind of cinema platform, but I think it will be quite low scale. You won't get the Little Miss Sunshine that gets the word of mouth, gets the buzz, gets kind of expanded into cinemas. I think we're going to see something quite different with Fox Searchlight cinema.
I think A24, certainly by the looks of their awards season campaigning, where they're pushing several titles, including sort of The Lighthouse, Farewell, Waves, Uncut Gems. They clearly maybe see that there's now a gap in the market for them to move into it and to become one of the big primetime players in this. And I think it's only a good thing that there is sort of competition in that arena, that, you know, people, there's still an avenue. You know, they're clearly very supportive of independent auteur filmmakers. You just have to look at the fact that sort of Robert Eggers and sort of Ari Aster, you know, and sort of Trey Edward Schultz have, you know, made a couple of films, 2 or 3 films with them now, and, you know, they want to keep that sort of talent. They have an eye for talent, you know, and talent that isn't being poached immediately for Marvel movies and other big tempo blockbusters and stuff like that. They're able to keep the things, and, you know, Lulu Wang was, and so I think Trey Edward Schultz are glad that they've gone with A24 for their releases, rather than, you know, being offered potentially more money up front or in the long term to go with a streaming service. But they think that A24 is the way to go in order to get that proper sort of theatrical run, and I guess sort of leading into sort of the awards season sort of categories as well. But I guess Netflix and Amazon Prime are both sort of pushing for awards as well. So I think it's going to be very interesting sort of January, sort of February time to see how all this plays out. And I think with the number of awards sort of films which are going through streaming platforms, I think there's going to come to a point where I think the cinema chains will have to take notice and have to start playing these films, because, you know, there's certainly not enough blockbusters to keep them going through that sort of January, February, March time, when, you know, that is the traditional award season where you get sort of 2 or 3 of these films every week. And, you know, they say all the major money, major profits comes from these films, but at this moment there's certainly not enough, and they're too expensive to provide, you know, a couple of these every single week of the year. You know, cinemas cannot survive purely on these blockbusters alone, because there's just too much money involved in producing them that the studios can't do it. You know, one would argue that maybe Netflix can't either. I don't know where they keep finding the money from to finance all these big, you know, Irishman films that cost $200 million. Who knows where the money comes from for that? At one point, maybe that bubble will burst. But I think at some point the cinemas are going to have to realize, you know, there's always waves with these things. You know, 3D came and went. You know, 3D and sort of was brought in the 50s to sort of lure people back to the cinemas from in front of the TV sets. And then there was a similar thing when you had VHS came in and stuff like that. 3D eventually came back in towards the noughties. It's kind of gone again, but there's always going to be something. You know, you've got these sort of event immersive screenings and stuff like that, things that you can't get at home. So I guess it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years. What's the next big thing, I guess, that cinemas are going to provide in order to get people back in and get those bums on seats.
I'm sure whatever it is, we'll be sure to cover it.
Yeah, exactly. So have you got any final thoughts on the Scorsese MCU debate, or is it just simply an argument that will have no definitive answer, and we should just draw a line under it and move on to the next thing and start a debate about something else?
Yeah, you've taken the words out of my mouth. I'm banging the gavel, and that is the end of this discourse. Please all move on now to talking about they've added more things to sort of Greedo or whatever shooting Han Solo. Go chat about that for a few days.
I think, or chat about the fact that apparently the rumour is Cats may not be finished in time for a proper awards season run. What is this about?
Yes.
This is tragic, absolutely tragic. Actually, no, the other big talking point is people at the moment already still talking about best of the decade and best of 2019 lists when the decade in 2019 is not over yet. We've got to at least wait until Star Wars and Cats is out and Little Women before we can make a final decision. But
Exactly. You can do a preliminary list.
Exactly.
You can do a little draft on Letterboxd, but you cannot officially publish it until after Boxing
I think
Day.
Boxing Day is the thing. I mean, I've already said that I will collate all the lists for the Nerd Party and see if we can pull together. Obviously, there's a very wide pool to draw from, especially of a decade list. But hopefully, we should be able to get a good top 5 for 2019 and the decade that we can post at the end of the year once everyone's seen everything on Boxing Day. Because obviously, we don't want to spend any more time with our families. Christmas Day is enough. Although actually, people may be watching it on Christmas Day in America as well, because they're open on Christmas Day. I wish it was open on Christmas Day over here sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Beats watching EastEnders.
Exactly, or Strictly Come Dancing. And there's not a Doctor Who on this year, is it? So, yeah. Cinemas in the UK open on Christmas Day. We need something to watch. But,
Just after we said their staff are underpaid and go work on Christmas Day.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. The cinema chains are not going to pay double time for a public holiday, are they? Okay, yeah, Boxing Day it is then. But, we here on Filibuster always champion, the underdogs, the sort of more independent films. And at the moment, this year, we've been championing 52 films by women, where each week, we select a film directed by a woman to sort of share with you and add to your list. So, Lee, what have you picked for us this week?
Yeah, as you were kind of touching on earlier, I've sort of gravitated towards watching a lot more indie movies at home because I've been kind of starved of choice in UK cinemas, and sometimes there's great many films that I would love to see in the UK cinemas or even have the option to watch here in the UK but have been deprived of it. And one of the films I recently rented from America, the iTunes store there, is Little Woods, so starring Tessa Thompson and Lily James. So this is from Neon, so one of the kind of bright hopes for the future of independent cinema. So it's all about Ollie, who has illicitly helped the struggling residents of her North Dakota oil boomtown access Canadian healthcare and medication. When the authorities catch on to her, she plans to abandon her crusade only to be dragged in even deeper after a desperate plea from her sister. So yeah, one of the highlights of kind of the year for me. So from Nia DaCosta, and starring someone like Tessa Thompson, who apart from Men in Black International seems to do no wrong at the moment. So one of these great films that I hope eventually comes to the UK. Otherwise, I'm going to have to kind of keep seeking these films from America and paying them the money as opposed to UK distributors and cinemas.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a few months ago we were actually on a pretty good run in terms of sort of female-directed films getting releases in the cinema, but yeah, it has kind of dried up here in the UK, so we are having to go to iTunes USA or Netflix for my pick this week, and I'm off to Japan next year, so I was looking for some Japanese films to watch, and I found A Silent Voice, which is an anime film directed by Naoko Yamada, and it got a cinema release, I think, last year, and it's about a young man who's ostracized by his classmates after he bullies a deaf girl to the point where she moves away. Years later, he sets off on a path of redemption. And this was quite an interesting one, similar to one of my favorite films of the decade. Actually, it's in my provisional list, which was Your Name, a sort of body swap comedy that turns into something else. Similar style to this one, where it's looking at sort of the effects of bullying and stuff like that in school and how it can sort of taint your entire life, about how a man is basically sort of his choices define who he is later on in life through one bad decision, and how he sets out to make amends for that. And it's a really sort of moving, sort of touching story, and it's definitely worth a recommendation, and it's available on Netflix UK just now, possibly Netflix USA as well, but definitely worth your time for that one. Have you seen this one?
No, I haven't, but I really enjoyed Your Name, so you've got me kind of sold to check this one out.
No, it's one that was sort of featured on, I think it did actually get a cinema release with, I think, like Scotland Loves Anime and stuff like that, so it's definitely worth a bit of your time as well. And yeah, we'll be back next week, hopefully with Kim to potentially look at The Shining and Doctor Sleep as well, and potentially also I think both of us have now seen Midsummer Director's Cut, so it's going to be interesting to see what Kim makes of that one as well. It's an interesting additional few minutes in that one, but I think, like you say, it definitely comes down on a clear, hard line as to Christian's fate and whether or not he deserved it after watching it. Total dick. But if you've enjoyed this episode of Filibuster or any of the other ones, always head on to iTunes and leave us a rating as well. And if you enjoy our other podcast, the A24 Project, we're currently running a competition on that, where if you leave us a written review on iTunes, you can get put into the prize draw to potentially win a mug of your choice. In the last month, the A24 have, always known for their hot merchandise, and they've released mugs. They've got one mug for every single film which they have released, so that's up to about 90 odd mugs. I don't think anyone will need 90 mugs, but you can pick a mug of your favorite film. So it could be Under the Skin, it could be The Lighthouse, or it could be A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III. We're not here to judge, so head on to iTunes, give us a review, and you'll get into the prize draw, and that'll be drawn in the first week of December. We always like to hear your thoughts and feedback, whether it's what you enjoy about the show or maybe what you'd like to see us sort of talk about in a future episode. So, leave us a note there. But Lee, in the meantime, if people want to, unfortunately, continue the discourse as to whether Martin Scorsese was right or not about MCU, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at @LeeHutchison_. And what about yourself?
And they can get me on Twitter at JumpCelluloid. So that's us, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.
Welcome to Nerd Party.